Good morning. Good morning, y'all. My name is Andrea. I am here with Missy. I will be presenting a little bit about our work, what we've learned, some of the best practices we know. Before we get started, I do just want to name, while I come with information and knowledge, I am by no means the one that holds all the information and knowledge. So if there are things that you would like to add, if there are things that you also would like to enrich this training with, please do so. Feel free to speak out, share in the chat. If you are sharing in the chat in the midst of me presenting, know that I don't usually keep eyes on it until we pause and do some chat activities. So it might take me a minute to realize that that's there. And Monica said that she would be supporting to catch some of those things. But by all means, feel free to speak out and add to the training. So I'm going to share my screen. I just realized they have like all these new little layout options for sharing your screen. I haven't done a Zoom presentation. I've been in person this whole year. So I am just going to share the slides. They have like an option where you can like float in the front of the screen and the front of the slides, like a little floating head. Kind of like it, I kind of don't. So I'm going to do it this way for now. Um, is everyone good? Can people see my screen? Can people see the slide? All right. Thank you. So the meeting is being recorded. I'm in case you missed a little message, just so you all know if there's any confidentiality pieces where you don't want your voice heard or you want your face seen, please make sure you turn off those things and put things in the chat so we don't record that. So to get us started, just some agreements as a group, keeping things confidential as we're going through these slides. Sometimes people's personal experience come through and making sure that we are keeping that here. If there is something someone shares that feels really impactful or just feels like really full of knowledge, making sure you take that knowledge and not the story. And if you do want to take the story, make sure you check in with that person that it's okay to share out. Because we don't want to take people's stories and just start, sharing them out freely without that consent. Intent versus impact in these conversations. Sometimes, we may have the best of intentions, but the way things land and the way things actually end up impacting people can be hurtful or can be harmful. So being able to both know that people aren't coming in with the intent to do harm, but also having the humility that when we do, being able to just, step back, say sorry, and see where we can learn. Curious about discomfort. As we're having the conversation, sometimes some of these things can push up against values, existing ways that we viewed this issue or, conflicting issues. And just wondering if we're getting uncomfortable with what is being said, if we're in disagreement with what is being said, and we want to push up against it, I'm just taking a pause and wondering what's coming up for us. It's by no means an ask that you're going to change your viewpoint or you're going to change your value system, but it is an opportunity to consider that there are other ways of being, that there are other ways of thinking, and that we may not have considered certain things based on our own experiences. And then, of course, take care of yourself. We're here for about an hour and a half. If you need water, if some of these things start getting a little hard to listen through, please do take care of yourself. Water, breathing, stretching, move that energy around so that we can come out of this in a healthy way. So, who are we? Why are we presenting? What is our experience and what do we bring into this work? MISSY has been around this is our 16th year in service. We are based in Oakland, and we started in Oakland. We, since inception, have served youth in the Bay Area. We continue to serve young people throughout the Bay Area. Our service area is about 90 miles out from Oakland. We are able to go out pretty far when young people get moved around or just young people that are located outside of, the immediate Bay Area. We serve young people ages 12 to 24. They are not hard stops. We do have some wiggle room in there. Currently, we are serving, I think it's like one 10-year-old and two 11-year-olds. So there is some flex, but our service and our programs are really centered in ages 12 to 24. And some of our funding is also really tied to that age group. But if you have questions, if you have someone and you're like, oh, could this maybe be someone you could serve, you can send them our way, or you can give us a call. And if we can't be the person to support, we can try to connect you to some resources or who might be the right service provider. I myself have been with MISSY for 6 years. Prior to this, I was doing work within the domestic violence field and the sexual violence field. I've been doing work within interpersonal violence for over 15 years, and along with working with youth. So this is just kind of a coming together of both of those things. So that's the lens I bring into this work. A little bit more about MISSY. We have a variety of services. Our lowest barrier service is our Star Center, and that's our drop-in center. So you can come by, young people can get basic needs met there. So food, we have hot meals, we have groceries, we have snack bags. They can come in and get hygiene kits, get support with being able to get IDs and documents. We do often host workshops and events as well as mobile resources. We also have a drop-in center at Fierce Advocates in Richmond near the Kaiser Permanente. We do a pop-up there, but we will be there more presently in the coming months. Our more intense services are our transformational coaches. So our transformational coaches provide crisis counseling, peer counseling, case management. They do goal setting with young people. We are big on celebrations and incentivizing youth to move towards their goals. So almost all our goals and our planning is connected to an incentive or an opportunity to celebrate when those things are accomplished. We are working with young people, so wanting to make sure that we're celebrating them and bringing in the element of fun in the work that we do. Our newest program is our housing program. It has really taken off in the last year. We've done a lot of work around like shelter vouchers and financial support for individuals who maybe are looking to move in and they need help with the deposit, they need help with first month's rent, or maybe catching up on some back rent. We're able to offer that support on a case-by-case basis. But moving forward, we are moving into having an emergency shelter. We are in the midst of that, so we'll keep you all posted once we are settled and are actually able to offer that as a full service. Our housing department also supports with, like, if somebody's looking for apartments, we can help do the visits, we can do advocacy work. We can offer some legal recourse and resources. So it's pretty broad in what we can do there. And then the other part of our work, aside from the direct service to young people, is getting to work with providers like y'all. So collaborating, building out resources, outreach, training opportunities. We also have prevention. So we have been in the process of getting into Dijon Middle School in Richmond. We are in Oakland Unified School District. So if you have any youth programs, any youth centers that we could come and lead some workshops in, we have a 6-week federally approved human trafficking prevention workshop. We are able to do the full 6 weeks. We're also able to break it up if we're only have capacity to do a couple workshops. And we are happy to bring those to you all. We come with snacks, we come with activities, we come with art pieces. So it's an interactive and it's a fun way for young people to start learning and having the opportunity to discuss some of the tools and some of the things that come up with trafficking. So things like consent, boundaries, how to recognize, what's a healthy relationship versus unhealthy, and not just from a prescripted place of an adult telling them, but for them to really be able to identify those things from themselves and really be able to have like an internal understanding of what that means to them. All right, so we're going to go over just some basics to start off. I'm going to breeze through this stuff. It's my understanding you already did some training on this, and most of you, I think, come probably with at least like a Human Trafficking 101 or a CSEC 101. If at any point you want me to expand more, please pause me, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these definitions and things like that. Any questions on our agreements? Any questions on MISSY so far? All right, if anything comes up for y'all, please let me know. So human trafficking, big umbrella term, depending on where we are in the world, it's gonna look a little bit different. Here in the US, it's defined as labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Things like child brides, child soldiers, which are applicable in other parts of the world, are not part of our definition. However, it's not to say those things aren't present here, and it's not to say that those things don't happen. Trafficking, like other forms of interpersonal violence, happen within power and control dynamics. Power and control wheel, are you all familiar with it? Anybody not familiar with the power and control wheel? No, everybody has seen it. So domestic violence, sexual violence, all also have power and control wheels. They have their differences. There are also a lot of crossover within all these issues, and part of that is because of that interpersonal piece, right? It's how do people have and gain and keep power and control over others? So a lot of those tactics, a lot of those experiences do cross over and mirror, but there are differences. So it is important to not just put them all into one piece. One thing can lead to another, right? Not all instances of sexual violence are instances of trafficking. Not all instances of DV are instances of trafficking, but there are crossovers, particularly given the nature in which some of these things occur. So just briefly, to do a quick overview, what are in kind of like centering human trafficking, centering exploitation, what are some ways that we think privilege shows up within power dynamics and unequal power dynamics? Y'all can pop it in the chat or you can share out. How do you think privilege shows up?
I would think maybe in terms of privilege of having like stable housing, privilege of having access to finances, things like that.
Definitely. Resources, right? So many things that make individuals vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation is not being able to have those basic needs met, right? So that's definitely something that puts people at risk. And those that do have it have privilege, right, over those that don't. I mean, that can definitely get used to exploit. Anything else? Rewarding victims for control purposes, yes. So gifting people, right? If you did the right thing, or if you did what I asked you to do, there are reward systems. I mean, we see it throughout, even within the way that when there are exploiters, when there's like the third party exploiter present, and the way they set up it's hierarchical, right? So they have like their bottom girl, their main girl. And the bottom is either the person who's been there the longest, or it's the person who's pulling in the most money. And so that person has more access to things, right? They're the ones that get the first outfits, and they're the ones that get their hair done, and they're the ones that get to get their nails done, or they actually get to hold money, where other young people may not. They're the ones that make sure the other girls are in line. So even in that, there's like this reward system built into how the exploitation happens when there's that group setting. Even just having both parents present, yes, that can be a privilege, right? Having it's a multiple support system, and when those relationships are healthy and supportive. Thank you. Anything else that comes to mind?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I just was at another training that talked about, which had not occurred to me, the privilege within the trafficking system of being lighter skinned than darker skinned.
Yes.
So the privilege of skin color.
So colorism, right? Things like racism and colorism come into play. And we will talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides, but thank you for bringing that in. Right. And this is also where we see things like gender roles, gender dynamics come into play. There is a reason, and it's not accidental that girls and femme-identified youth and gender and youth that are part of the gender binary are impacted at higher rates. Those privileges, those inequities that exist in our society are also showcased and highlighted here at a higher rate.
Is language also a privilege that plays a huge role on a lot of sex trafficking or human trafficking?
Language access is definitely a privilege. I think like in anything, it's going to play a role with any forms of violence, right? If I'm able to communicate if I'm able to have access to and be able to identify resources and be able to control what you know and what information comes to you, then that definitely, language access definitely is a privilege. Thank you all. You know, age, you know, especially when we're working with youth that are underage is also a privilege. You know, if you're a minor, you're not able to, you know, really just go seek employment. You're not able to go seek housing. You couldn't apply for an apartment on your own. So naturally, the way our system is set up, young people are tethered to an adult. Right? You need to have an adult to be able to access some of these basic needs. While it's done with, I think, an intention of safety, when the adults in our life are not safe and aren't able to provide and be there for us, it becomes a vulnerability and it puts us at risk. Some of these other ones, right? Financial is another big one. We know that it's present, it's, you know, highly present. It creates, again, a piece around privilege, but also the dynamics within exploitation where individuals who are exploited don't often get to kind of hold money. They have to give it to somebody else, or they're having to exchange these sexual encounters to meet basic needs. It creates this additional layer of like that financial trauma and that kind of like unhealthy relationship within finances and that dynamic. So I think also keeping that in mind. And then isolation is a big one. Isolation is, you know, one of the things that first gets implemented and a really powerful tool to keeping people from being able to seek resource and support. But then also considering how as providers, how as society, we sometimes play a role in the isolation of individuals who are exploited and trafficked. While they may be getting messages from exploiters and traffickers that they aren't welcomed into the larger world, or, you know, that nobody's going to want them now, or that, you know, they're not good for anything else. As a society, we don't do the best job of welcoming people back in, right? So when people maybe are seeing individuals on the street or coming off the street or dressed in a particular way, they don't tend to get the warmest of welcomes, right? They may not even get eye contact from people. So in the same way, we often repeat those messages in our own ways, right? There is judgment. There's a lot of really harmful and negative words that are used towards individuals that are engaged in any type of commercial sex, whether they're naming it as sex work or whether it's exploitation or trafficking that's happening. So as a society, we also sometimes add to that isolation. Any questions on any of these slices that feel unclear as to how they could play a role in these dynamics? All right. Labor trafficking, just briefly on labor trafficking, we know that both forms of trafficking, labor trafficking and sex trafficking and or exploitation can happen concurrently. We also know that having one present creates openings and susceptible opportunities for people to engage in the other. Right? Because if I'm already in a situation that's exploitative, it could be easy for me to just switch out between them. What is also true is that there are labor practices that are exploitative that aren't necessarily illegal. So I think just overall creating like these overall social dynamics that can sometimes normalize exploitation, right? And so how are we able to kind of like have these really open conversations and really bring more opportunities of understanding to people we serve? So we're able to pull apart some of these behaviors that are harmful and also being able to name like, hey, this is harmful and exploitative, and it's also legal within our country, and being able to have that honest conversation. One of the things that we often see with youth that are exploited and trafficked, I'd say the most common form of labor trafficking is criminal enterprise. And so that's engaging in things like shoplifting, you know, it could be assault on others. When, you know, young people are wanting to leave or, you know, stepping out of line, exploiters will often have other young people go and attack that young person, or will have them go track that young person down, which can lead to those young people getting, you know, criminal charges. And so knowing that those things are also present, a lot of times people aren't identifying that as labor trafficking, right? They're not identifying the criminal enterprise as labor trafficking. It could include drug sales or drug transportation. We also can see it in like the car breaking, so all like the bipping and stuff like that, that's also part, a lot of times it's young people that are being used in that. It's not adults that are doing those things, but it is usually an adult that's kind of like navigating and coordinating all that. So sex trafficking really specifically speaks to instances in which sexual intercourse takes place and or is intended. So sex trafficking sits underneath the sexual exploitation umbrella. The sexual exploitation umbrella is much broader, and we serve youth that are sexually exploited, not just trafficked. So sexual exploitation can include things like sexually explicit performances through dance or massage, survival sex, escort services, as well as child sexual abuse material. Can someone share what they know survival sex to be, or what that means?
As I understand it to mean, it could be former foster youth that are running away, or it could be LGBTQ plus running away, and they have no other means of survival. And they engage in this. And as I understand, traffickers can identify these people, like a lot of them, in 24 hours, that they are engaging in this for their survival.
Yes. So anytime individuals are having to engage in any of like these sexual acts to meet basic survival needs, right? So it could be food, it could be housing, it could be transportation, it could be having access to clothing, it could be safety, right? Maybe you're in an area in which there is gang activity or high instances of violence, and the sexual acts are used as a way to keep yourself safe or keep individuals that you know safe. Isabella Kate brought in, they'll ask like, oh, are you hungry? I have food. Just do this one thing for me. I won't tell anyone. Yes. So it's definitely set up. We also have, individuals who will sometimes say, well, if I turn this date tonight, then, they'll buy a hotel room and I'll have somewhere safe to stay tonight. I'll have a bed. I'll have somewhere to stay tonight. Right. So it's engaging in that to have those basic needs met. What about child sexual abuse material? Is anyone familiar with that term? No. So child sexual abuse material, if anybody wants to pop in, I'm happy to pause, but it's what's sometimes incorrectly named as child pornography. Yes, what somebody calls child porn, images and videos. So we want to be really clear about what we're speaking of, because language is important. Words matter, right? And when pornography is speaking to media that's created by consenting adults for the pleasure of consenting adults, ideally. Now, we want to make sure that when we're talking about consent and pleasure, we're not bringing children into it, and we're not bringing youth into it. So really breaking up that language, and it's not child pornography, it's child sexual abuse material, really naming what it is. And that starts, really breaking up how we're starting to view some of these happenings and instances that cause harm. Street exploitation. I think most people are familiar with it. It's what I think a lot of times people have come to mind. Here in Oakland, most street exploitation takes place on International, East 14th. I think just to give a little context of the impact of trafficking and exploitation here in California and the Bay Area is Oakland is known to have the longest track in the nation. And if you don't know what the track is the colloquial term for the street in which commercial sex takes place. So here they call it the track, the blade, the stroll. And they're good. It's good to know this language because if you're hearing people use these terms, they could be telling you a lot with that. They could be telling you a lot about some of the support you might be able to connect them with. So that is what street exploitation, where that takes place. And we definitely see it, in its shifts, right? Sometimes they're on, like here, sometimes they're on International, sometimes they move up to Foothills, sometimes they pull them off the street and they're predominantly using hotels. So it can definitely look different. All right. So I think as somebody named earlier, some of the other things that really play a role in exploitation. Can we type the terms? Yes, sorry. I'm going to take a quick pause and just put some of those terms. Here in the Bay, like the most common term is the track. The blade tends to be more like Los Angeles, Arizona language, but it's made its way up here. And then somebody put the game being involved. We also hear the life. People being a part of the life. So those are also, I think, things to keep an eye out for if we're starting to hear those or if somebody's starting to engage and using that language. So back to this slide is, we want to make sure that, yes, we recognize that trafficking and exploitation can happen to anyone, right? It can impact individuals across all different sectors. However, what we also know to be true is that there are communities and individuals that are impacted at disproportionate rates. And that's both locally as well as nationwide. So we know that Black girls are impacted at disproportionate rates along with Native girls, followed by Latin youth and Southeast Asian girls. So it's important that we hold on to those things because it can be really easy to generalize and then move away from some of the root issues of why this is. Right. So move away from the conversations that also need to be had around why girls are being made vulnerable, and they are being made vulnerable. They aren't vulnerable inherently, right? It's not anything, it's not an onus or a fault of theirs. They are made vulnerable through systems. And I think, as the adults, especially adults in this space, we are the systems. So how are we taking the pauses? How are we taking the time? How are we taking the reflection of really understanding, are we being part of the support? Are we being part of the people that are, creating systems that are helpful and considerate and really keeping these things in mind? Or are we doing harm? Or are we just not, maybe, are we sitting in the middle where we could be more of a support and we're not acknowledging some of the ways that the systems are harmful? So intersections of oppression, this is an image around intersectionality and a quote by Dr. Lee Kimberly Crenshaw, who I don't say coined the term, but really brought it into like academia into the broader sense. So intersectionality, really speaks to the intersecting identities that people hold and how those creates not only different areas of vulnerability because of these different isms, but it also sometimes really names how we're able to then access support and resource. There is also a piece around who is considered more valuable, more deserving, more valuable and more deserving to resource and support, who is then further harmed and very often criminalized for the things that are happening to them, right? And we do see that across the board through also the higher rates of prostitution charges towards Black women across the nation. So it's like these things are happening and occurring, and rather than receiving support and resource, they are then criminalized and further harmed and institutionalized. So how are we having those conversations along with these? How are we also addressing those things? Because otherwise we're never going to get to it. We're always just going to scratch the surface. So again, we are the systems now. So how are we being a system of support and not a system of failure? Also keeping this in mind when we're providing support to youth, sometimes it can, or individuals in general, it can get really easy to default to leading young people or leading individuals back into systems that have been inherently harmful to them. right? So sometimes it's like, well, if you just connect back with your family, or if you just started going to school, or if you just went to the doctors, and seek this medical support without actually taking the time to hear and understand why they may not be engaging with these systems already, what their journey and what their history has been. Some of these spaces that we may have positive relationship or experiences with may not be true for them. Right? These are very often the very systems in which harm initially occurs. These are the systems that have often failed youth and created some of these vulnerabilities. So how are we just meeting people where they're at, really listening to what they're telling us, doing the work to find alternatives, or doing the work to prep and doing the groundwork to ensure that when we are reconnecting them to some of these systems, especially if there's a history of harm, that we're doing the piece to make sure that we're advocating, staying present, so that when young people tell us like, hey, this was my experience, we're believing them, and really listening and finding alternatives so that they're being able to provide services and not just moving from our own experience and our own biases. So risk factors and pathways. What are some risk factors that what are some things that you all think put individuals at risk for exploitation?
As I
Being, oh,
Mhm.
being kicked out of the house by the parents.
Oh, being kicked out of the house. Yes.
involvement in the child welfare system.
Yes.
I was going to mention probably if you've been a victim of sexual abuse.
Yes.
I was thinking that there's some things like not so obvious, and things that we focus on is that it can start as early as elementary school with kids and bullying, sort of being demeaned throughout their life. And then it becomes something that, a child that would be in a different situation would not be as vulnerable to being exploited, where they're going to feel loved and cared for. It's not really love and cared for, but in their minds it is when someone pays attention to them. But I think the education system not paying close attention to the bully thing, I think it has a lot more, the ramifications of bullying are a lot greater, have a lot more impact than just what's going on at that moment, can make a big impact on how a child reacts as they get older and become victims of this kind of thing.
Mhm.
I'd like to add social media.
Mm. How do you think social media becomes a risk factor?
Because I've been looking into this, and there's an increase in recruitment for CSEC, for child sexual exploitation over the internet. And as a trainer myself, I like to point out to my mainly white audience, I like to point out that like this is happening it really does cross all socioeconomic, cultural, and religious boundaries. And so young people on the media can be induced, and apparently, unless I'm incorrect, the incidence of it is going up.
Yes, I mean, I think media, social media definitely gets brought into the conversation a lot. And I think that there are risk factors that are present in social media. I think one of the things that I try to keep in my framework is that social media is a tool. And social media is kind of like what is it? Like a space that is really a reflection of the larger society. So I think, how do we also look at like, what are the things that are happening and what are the risk factors within the larger society that create this community and create those risk factors? So it's like, this is a tool. There were tools prior to this, right, that were used in other ways. And now that exploiters have access to this tool, we're just being able to capture it and see it in this. But definitely, what are some of the ways that we can save keep, and what are some of the ways that we can bring conversations to young people around how are they engaging with this tool? What is the way that they are participating in some of these conversations, and how are they being able to recognize it? Because if they can recognize it in an app, they'll also be able to recognize it in real life. They'll also be able to recognize it when, maybe work relationships are exploitative, or when romantic relationships become exploitative or abusive. So it's like, how can we also broaden the conversation? But I want to read some of the other things that are also coming in. So poor treatment within being part of the LGBTQ plus community, being a victim, having a history of other forms of abuse, including domestic violence, sexual instances of sexual violence or previous instances of sexual violence, being compared to models or celebrities and being promised to be like that by someone, mental health issues, low support, high punishment models, and peer pressure to be or look a certain way. And we will definitely get to some of these as we go. Some of the things that have generally been recognized as risk factors are definitely previous instances of sexual violence, being systems involved. So whether it's foster care or the juvenile justice system, some of the things we hear from youth regarding why that is very early on. They have learned that their care is dependent on somebody being paid for it. So people don't care and are present for them for the sake of being there and present for them. It's because somebody is receiving some sort of financial support for it. So exploitation and somebody you having to work for, or you having to provide and contribute, becomes just part of the history they've already had. Previous mental health issues, definitely we will talk a little bit more as how trauma plays a role and some of the ways that that most oftenly shows up for youth. Another one that plays a role and is a risk factor, as we named a little bit earlier in terms of privilege, is age, right? So again, having needs that are not being met. And one of those needs is definitely connection, right? So when we're talking about instances of like bullying or being othered in some capacity, including individuals who are part of the LGBTQ plus community and they are experiencing violence or harm, being part of community and having connection is absolutely vital to us as humans. This is how we have survived as a species and a race, and it's something that continues to be present for us. We are wired to seek connection. So connection, community, care is definitely one of the things that puts young people at risk, along with the other pieces that are present. So how do young people sometimes find their way in? Things start off with grooming. As we mentioned early on, this is an interpersonal violence, part of the interpersonal violence kind of issues and concerns. It is rarely, and I won't say never, but it is rarely that, somebody is just picked off the street, or somebody gets drugged in a bathroom stall and taken away. That is not usually how it happens. What we know and what we learn, even when somebody gets picked up off the street, even when somebody ends up being, there's substances that are used, there was usually a relationship already started or engaged that then led to that. Right. So very often we're like, had you ever seen this person before? And they're like, oh, yeah, I've seen them around, or they've talked to me before, or yeah, they've, contacted me on social media, but I didn't respond. And then the violence escalated. Right. Or yeah, I did know the person who, use substances. I was at a party with them, or I went out with them, or that was my friend, or, I was meeting somebody there, and then things escalate. So they often happen within some sort of relationship. There is usually some sort of connection that has taken place prior to the violence escalating and the exploitation initiating. One of the ways that we very often see exploitation, and that's across age groups, is the exploitation through intimate relationship. So whether it's a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a partner of some sort, that relationship is started and built with the intention to then exploit and traffic. But throughout all the relationships, they happen just like any other relationship happens, which is why it can be really hard to identify. Right? So they're just gaining trust. They're just getting to know you. They're often finding vulnerabilities and meeting needs. So going back to some of those vulnerabilities of not having, stable housing, not having access to food, not having access to connection, feeling like you maybe don't have community, they start learning these things and they start meeting those needs. right? They start providing in these spaces that maybe this individual hasn't previously been supported. From there, tactics like love bombing are used. Is everyone familiar with love bombing, or can anybody share what love bombing is? I feel like it became quite a catchword in social media for a while. No one has a love bombing?
I mean, it starts off by like I love you and buying things for them, and you know, just like saying how beautiful they are, and like all about them.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about the person. Like nobody else exists but that person.
Yes. Somebody had put in over the top expressions of affection. Yes, it's just like this overpour. It's exactly what it says, right? They're just bombing you with love, whatever it is you enjoy. One of the things I find is that exploiters tend to know people's love languages really well. If you're familiar with love languages, they tend to be able to catch your love language. So do you like words of affirmation? I am telling you all the beautiful things, all the wonderful things. You like gifts? I will show up with little flowers, little notes, maybe a coffee. You like, quality time. I'm texting you. I'm hanging out with you. I put my phone down. So it's this excessive show of love and affection. But it's a cycle. So then the second part of that cycle is that it gets taken away, whether a fight is picked, whether somebody just disappears, whether somebody just stops, it's taken away. And then it's reintroduced. So then all the affection, all that love, all that praise comes back in. Visually, I think of it as putting somebody on a pedestal, raising that pedestal really high, kicking that pedestal out from underneath them, and then popping it back underneath them right before they hit the ground, and then repeating that. That does a couple things emotionally, psychologically. It really creates a lot of these feelings like up and down, a lot of confusion. One of the things that happens is when somebody's being fantastic and wonderful to you and they stop, one of the first things we do is, what did I do? I must have done something wrong. So really early on, the self-blame starts kicking in and starts being used. It also starts creating dependency on that person for feeling good. You start looking at that person as the only one that can make you feel this way, right? Because we have all these chemical releases that are beautiful and wonderful, and then they leave us. And then we do it again. So there's a lot of different ways that has a big impact and creates connections. And I think also knowing that some of these things are happening, they're just happening in our body. They're just happening because this is what happened when we have these engagements. It's not something that we're necessarily processing and thinking, right? They're happening without us sometimes realizing that this is what is occurring. So that's why it can be really tricky as things start to develop. And then, tactics like isolation and manipulation, that use of power and control start coming in, that it can be hard to pick up and identify that that's where we're moving into. That's also kind of like what I think of like the feel out stage. So an exploiter might start dropping hints, saying little things like, if I was in trouble, would you do anything to help me out? Or if I got into this, would you be there for me? How loyal are you? Do you really have my back? Start dropping those little things that start feeling out where somebody's at, and kind of start making that person feel like, oh yeah, I have to prove that this is, how much I care, or what my love is, or, how much I'm really who I say I am. After that, things build up, more of those power and control tactics are used, violence generally escalates, and that violence does not necessarily have to be physical, although it can get to physical violence as well. And we see that violence escalate when, say, somebody is no longer wanting to cooperate, say somebody is saying no, somebody's wanting to do something else, or not following the instruction of that exploiter. This is also when exploitation may begin, and people may start experiencing violence from buyers. So that violence starts kicking in from different sides. And then from there, it's indoctrination. And then by that point, that person might feel really dependent on the authority of a trafficker. And it's not dependent on the trafficker, but on their authority, right? They're looking to this person to let them know what they can and what they can't do. Trauma bonds don't always happen, but when they do, they've taken hold and bonded by this point. Trauma bonds can be one of those things that people have a really hard time navigating when they're supporting someone, because they'll sometimes get somebody really far in maybe a journey or a pathway, and then that exploiter comes back up, right? And that person will come back to the exploiter, and people are like, we got so far, like, why are they going back to them? Knowing that, needs were being met, there was care being given while, some of these really difficult and violent acts were happening, there's also some positives that take place within those relationships and within those spaces. For some individuals, this is also some of the best treatment they've received. Even if there has been harm, even if there has been hurt and violence, for some of them, it's some of the first times they're getting to have needs met. It's some of the first times they're getting to be a part of something. Some of the first times that somebody wants them and is, kind of like all forgiving and willing to accept them back. So I think also knowing that those dynamics are at play. And then on top of that, if a trauma bond has occurred, that's an additional layer and connection that happens. And a trauma bond is a coping thing. It's not something that we're aware or conscious of. It's something that our body and our brain just does automatically when it feels that we are trapped and in, danger, and our lives are at danger and we have no way of escaping the situation. We're not thinking of it, it just happens. And it can happen really quickly. It can happen within like 3 days, and it can take years to break that trauma bond, even after we're away from our captor. And that captor doesn't have to be a literal captor. If we think we are captive, then they are our captor. And then again, coming back to that sense of otherness, right? You're getting messaging from your exploiter, like nobody's going to want you. This is all you're good for. And then society is also not always the most welcoming. Young people may have been disengaged from school, disengaged from work, disengaged from community. It can be really hard to just try to step back into all those things if that has not been your experience. And you also haven't had the opportunity to, develop some of those skills or develop some of the ways that we engage in these spaces. So knowing that all, takes that all takes time as well. While it's a journey in, when individuals do choose to step away, it's also a journey out. And we serve youth that are impacted, at risk, currently being exploited, or previously exploited. We don't require anybody to want to or decide that they want to leave the life to receive support. We can meet people where they're at. If that's the choices that they're making right now, then that's the choices, and we can still offer a lot of care and support from that space. So I think some of the things that came up earlier were, some of the pathways include intimate relationships, fraudulent career opportunities, right? Somebody had put earlier, like somebody saying that you could be that model. We saw it in social media with like our influencers, like, oh, you're really pretty, you could be an influencer. You can make a lot of money, you just have to do this, you just have to do that, right? And that can be a pathway to exploitation. Through that fraudulent career opportunity. Familial relationships, exploitation that happens within familial relationships, that's where we see the earliest age of entry. Those that are exploited by a family member are usually exploited beginning between ages 4 to 10. So it's the earliest age of entry. And it doesn't have to be a direct family member. It could be somebody who has family-like access. Right? So maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a babysitter, maybe it's a family friend who just has family-like access to this individual. And peer recruitment, right? That idea of, peer pressure, having individuals who look like us, are like us, or who we want to be like. Peer recruiters are our top recruiters. They're the ways that they pull in most of the young people for an exploiter. It's also really important to remember that a peer recruiter themselves is not an exploiter. They too are being exploited, right? And that can sometimes be another, soft spot for providers, because they will sometimes look at, well, they're pulling other youth, right? They're recruiting other youth, and they'll often want to push that young person away as a harmful person. And while we want to have clear boundaries and we want to have good process to limit harm and recruitment, we also don't want to then villainize that person and forget that they too are being exploited and they too need support and care, right? So being able to kind of hold both. All right, so moving into recognize, I do want to just take a quick breather. Any questions with everything we've covered? Anything that's coming up for anyone? Or that you would like to add? And Christina, you brought in parents who exploit children. Did you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
It's just sad to me that a lot of these children sometimes are being sexually exploited for parents' needs, which it could be rent, it could be drugs, it could be to satisfy gambling needs, whatever it is that it's just a sad thing that we don't talk about too much, is about parents exploiting their own children for their own personal needs.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, so we definitely, it is something that comes up. It is something that we see. And it is, coming back to like those risk factors, it is a means to meet a need, right? There is a need present that is not being met. And that relationship, around like, well, I'm your parent, and, whether it's from a place of authority, whether it's a place of loving care, people can use guilt, right? Well, do you want us to get kicked out of this place? Or do you want your siblings to not be able to eat tonight? Or if you won't do it, then I'm going to send, your little sibling out to do it. So all those things definitely play a role, but it's again, those dynamics, right, that exist within these relationships and really create all this vulnerability that can be exploited. Are there programs in schools that help identify kids at risk for this? There are programs. I think, we'll go a little bit more into recognizing, and we'll look at what some of the ways that, we can start flagging. I know that there's, more training that's coming into. Technically, by like California legislation, all schools should have some human trafficking training, both to students and to staff. Right? Everybody should receive some level of identification, some level of human trafficking 101. What is true with a lot of legislation is that there's no funding attached to it. So actually making that happen and who's actually holding those things and making sure it happens kind of sits in the nebulous space, right? Should it be taking place? Is it there are things for it to exist. How much is it happening? I don't know. We were in OUSD a couple years ago, and we were able to implement a lot of training to 7 schools specifically. But again, that was 7 schools within a district. So where is, some of those follow-ups, and, who are the people that get to kind of like champion those things within those spaces as well, saying like, this is important and we should have this and we should know this. So I think on the other end, it's like, who can champion that? But there are programs, there are providers who are happy and willing to bring this education to schools. So recognizing, so a lot of times when people go into the recognizing space, they're looking for like a checklist, right? What are the flags? What are the yellow flags? What are the red flags? How do I know? And we definitely have those, right? We know that things like truancy in schools, keeping unusual hours, somebody having a sudden change of affect, dress, or behavior, things like branding showing up. Is anybody familiar with branding? I want to share what branding is.
It's usually when they have their own mark. They have their own signature, so they put it on the person's body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so branding is exactly what it sounds like. It does come from, the idea of like farming and livestock, of branding a cow, branding a horse, right? It's putting your mark on a property. And that is how youth are viewed, right? So we see it through tattoos. People can get branded through like it's not called burning. It's got a name and I can't think of it. But branding and, just being really clear, not everybody that has a tattoo is being branded or is branded, right? Or is exploited or at risk of. But it is something that is used. Some of the ways that we know that that we might be able to identify that it's, a brand is we might be seeing the exact same mark on multiple places. And they're usually highly visible places. So you might see it on the forearm and the thigh and the face or the neck, on a shoulder. They're really obvious and you can see them, and they're in multiple spaces. So those are some of the ways that branding may show up. So yes, we have the yellow flags, we have the really clear things that we can see. But what is also true is identifying that somebody either may be at risk or may be exploited, is also being able to identify the non so clear things, right? And sometimes the things that get pushed off as that person's problem, or that end up getting that person labeled as problematic and maybe not worthy of support and care. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with trauma, but what we know is that most of the youth that we support have experienced and are experiencing complex trauma. Complex trauma is multi-layered, often beginning very early in life before age 4, which really starts shifting the way that impacts, right? During those early years of development, we're really gaining an understanding of what the world is. So really early on, we learn that the world is not safe, that the world is not, and that automatically starts to inform how we continue to navigate the world, relationships, as well as ourselves. Also, this trauma often impacts identity. So just our sense of who we are, our sense of how we are putting things together is highly impacted and not usually fully formed, and if formed, not in a healthy way. So what is also true is that as humans, our brain has a lot of plasticity, which means that that can also change, be reformed, be shifted, be healed, be, just creating new pathways that are healthy. So yes, this is true and this happens, and that does not mean that that has to continue to happen and that there's no other way of being, right? Or that people don't heal and haven't also done various, amounts of work. Complex trauma comes through various forms, including systemic and institutional, historical and intergenerational, community and place, as well as individual and interpersonal. Because these things are present, and because, if we go back to who is most impacted, right? So we're talking about Black girls, girls of color. These things are happening and have not only happened in life, but are continually and presently happening to them now. So we're also talking about people who have experienced harm and are continuing to navigate that harm in the current moment. Keeping that in mind when we're looking at therapy, when we're looking at counseling, when we're looking at all those things, that a lot of those therapeutic, tools we have are really based on somebody experiencing a traumatic event, either a one-time situation or something that happened for a period of time, but then it's stopping and then being able to navigate away from it. And then most of those therapies are based on that model, that they're not currently being harmed, that they have stepped away from that harm and then now they're able to engage in healing. And that is not true for most of the youth that we're serving. So when we're having a difficult time connecting to what's going to work best, know that a lot of the things that exist haven't really been applied or made for those that we serve. So it's going to look different. We're going to have to, play with it, figure it out, find alternatives. And again, really listen to what it is that they're telling us they need. So one of the things with trauma that also comes up is that it often shows up in our behaviors, right? It often shows up in the ways that we're able to engage and connect or not connect with others. And there are certain behaviors that are more socially acceptable than others. These are some of the behaviors that definitely are part of somebody, feeling overwhelmed, being triggered, feeling that they are in danger and they are not safe. We may see these things, but these things can often be very difficult for people to navigate. Right? These things can also end up being what people are labeled, right? Rather than it being identified as a behavior, it becomes a person. So rather than, this conversation or this instance, someone's trying to manipulate, they are manipulative, right? So how are we also pulling those things away? How are we being careful of the way that we use language, right? These are behaviors, these are not people. Right. And when we start naming people this, we're going to fail to see that whole person, and it's going to really impact the way we're able to support them. What is also true with behaviors is they're usually trying to tell us something. Behaviors are usually trying to let us know something else is going on. Sometimes something that person themselves is trying to navigate or figure out, or maybe doesn't have the language or capacity at that moment to navigate to. So I'm going to ask y'all to take a moment, identify which is the behavior that you have the most difficult time engaging with. When somebody shows up with this behavior, you're just like, oh man, I need to pull out my whole little toolbox and do all my breathing and all my counting and all my grounding pieces. Which is the one that does it for you? And if you can, pop it in the chat, please. Thank you. Right, so we have a few defiants, a few manipulatives, and more manipulatives. All right. Oh, egotistical. All right, let's start with defiant and manipulative since we have a few of them in there. When somebody's being defiant, what do you think could be happening underneath that behavior? What do you think that could be happening for that person? And you can pop it in the chat if you don't want to speak out, but you're also welcome to speak out.
Something that comes to mind for me is wanting to gain a sense of control.
Yeah, somebody popped in loss of control. Yes. Anger. So definitely feeling out of control can, it's an attempt to control things. Thank you, Deborah. So definitely. So with that, what is a way that we can respond? If we know that somebody's being defiant from feeling out of control of the situation and it's their attempt to regain that, what could we do in that situation to try to either de-escalate or just trying to acknowledge that we're aware, that we see what's happening? So bring in, maybe ask them what they need. How else can we share control? So something that I learned early on, give options when possible. Yes. So something that I learned early on is like when someone's being defiant, right? We're usually experiencing some sort of resistance, right? And for resistance to exist, you have to have two different objects exerting force. So I think also acknowledging where we're trying to force something to happen, right? Resistance doesn't happen without there being two different points of force. Because if I'm not forcing it, and if somebody's like pushing, then I'm just going to push over. So I have to be holding firm on something for that resistance to happen. So I think also definitely bringing in some active listening, really understanding like, am I trying to lead this? Am I trying to get somewhere myself? Just sometimes pausing. If, somebody's resisting and somebody's like being defiant from that place, just like pausing it, letting that, letting that breathe. So we stop having that push in those moments. Yes, acknowledge. I think again, like asking, like, what do you need? Like, hey, I'm noticing that, we're coming up against it. Like we're having different, I want you to know that I'm here to support you. Can you let me know what what would that look like for you? And it's not to say that I might be able to do that, but it would be good for me to know what support looks like for you or what those needs are that maybe I'm not getting to. So really being able to kind of like hand that over, right? And bring that back to that person. What was our other one that we had a lot of? Manipulative. What do you think manipulation is trying to tell us? What do you think is happening underneath that? Why do people want to not be completely upfront about something? Why would we not want to be completely upfront, right? Because underneath manipulation is that I'm not being completely upfront. Their sense of loss of control, again, another control piece.
Can it be they being manipulated?
Yeah, it could definitely be a learned behavior, right? This is how I've learned. Not trusting. Not wanting to be vulnerable. Yeah, if I'm honest and you say no, ooh, that's going to hurt more than if I'm dishonest and you say no. I can still, pull a card if I do it this way. It's worked in the past. Definitely. This is how I've gotten my needs met. So all those things can be true, can be present. It could be other pieces too, right? I think just knowing that there's a lot of different things, but yes, generally this is the way that I am navigating and having needs met. So knowing that someone's not, and I think with a lot of these things, we can jump into personalizing it, right? That person's trying to manipulate me. That person's being disrespectful to me. And most often, not always, but most often it has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with us. We're present. Sometimes we can be triggering, right? Sometimes for them, somebody who holds some of the identities I hold may have had certain engagements, and this is how they've learned to engage with individuals like me as a provider, as a woman, like all the different identities I hold can also inform somebody who they think they have to be to have their needs met. So yes, sometimes it is us, but even at that point, it's still their understanding and their learning, right? It may not be because they have to, be dishonest. That's just been their experience. So knowing that this is a way that they've had needs met, right? And that ultimately, usually when someone's showing up in a manipulative way, is they're trying to get some need met. There is something that you hold access and power to that they are scared you're going to say no to. That they're like, oop, if I am honest, they're going to tell me no on this. Or if I say this, they're not going to give me what I need. And ultimately, they're just trying to have that need met, right? So coming back to that, sometimes, again, being upfront, like, hey, I'm not saying that, this isn't you're not being honest, but I do want you to know that if, I'm clear about what your needs are, I'm more able to navigate or help you navigate to what that is. Sometimes it is, though, identifying that maybe in the past we've told them no. We've said like, no, I'm not going to let you have that. So now they are not going to be honest with us because we've shut them down in the past. And it might be, it might be within our boundaries. It might be within organizational boundaries. It's not from a place of harm, but all these things inform the way people show up. So being able to take those steps back, this is also us recognizing what are our triggers, what are our soft spots that we struggle with. So when the behaviors do come up, how are we able to pause? Sometimes it's tapping somebody else in, right? Sometimes it's like asking someone to sit with somebody or giving yourself a moment, just saying, hey, I'm going to help you with that. Let me go get a glass of water. Can I get you something to drink? When you really just need to go and stretch out and take a breather because you're starting to escalate, right? So how are you aware of those things so that we're able to continue to get curious and be present for individuals that we're serving? Something that I say, and this is really youth specific, but I think in general, when you're in this work, if you're not ready for a young person to cuss you out, then you're not ready for this work. Because they're individuals who have had a lot of impact. They're often coming off being exploited and they're coming straight to your office or are going to go back into that instance. There are high stressors. They are sometimes in danger. And they're sometimes just trying to get basic needs met. And we're asking them all these questions and we're further pushing these stressors. And so, yes, things escalate. Things escalate. Does that mean that we have to like it? No. Does it mean that we don't get to set boundaries? Yes. But how is that an opportunity to learn? How is it an opportunity to say like, hey, I don't like being yelled at. I want to help you, but maybe we could take a walk outside. Or maybe I can give you a few moments and we can come back to this conversation. Because I don't think it's going to get us to where we're trying to go. And I do want to be here and I want to be present. Right. But how do we also not make that about ourselves? Like, how dare them yell at me? How dare them disrespect me? I'm just trying to help them. I'm just trying to service them. It's not about that. It's not about us. Right, in those ways, but they are beautiful opportunities to teach people to engage in different ways. One of the best ways that we can model and say that people are deserving of healthy, supportive relationships is modeling a healthy and supportive relationships and ways of being. If we say yelling, if we say that, ideas of violence are not okay, then how are we also showing up in that way? So response and care, what do we do when we are coming across individuals, these different things are showing up, we're being able to identify that something's happening. I think also quickly not moving into wanting to label it. While labels can be helpful in letting us know what connections and resources to connect individuals to, they can also sometimes make us forget that that's a whole person. Right? That yes, this may be happening, but there's a whole bunch of other needs and other aspirations that they may also want to have access to that we're just, bypassing because we're trying to get to the label. Is it trafficking? Is it DV? Is it sexual violence? Like, yes, and we can still get them connected to resources without getting to that label, right? So again, getting curious, just really hearing people out and figuring out what their needs are. And if we get to that label, because what is also true is that not even when we can have an understanding that this is somebody's experience, they may still choose to not use that label to self-identify. And that doesn't mean that they're not deserving of care and that they don't need the support. But, letting people choose that for themselves. One of the most important factors in healing, and this is true for, therapeutic and clinical situations, is the relationship, right? That has actually, time after time, proven to be the most successful component of people being able to find therapies useful and successful, is the relationship. Some of the key things, to relationships, you can definitely look up. There's a lot of different ones, but what we use is curiosity, rapport building, trust development, and safety. And, when we're looking at trust development, remembering it's development, sometimes we expect people to inherently trust us when they walk into our office. Why won't they tell me? Why wouldn't they just be honest? Trust is developed. Trust is earned. Have you been trustworthy? And that includes how you behave and how you speak about individuals when they're not in the room. Because the way they are treated in a space lets them know how you have spoken about them, lets them know what you have shared with others. And also, do you take their stories and share them out? Or do you check in with them before you go and share with others? Do you make sure that you also have their permission around what parts of their narrative you're sharing out? Even if it's to seek further care, they should still get a say. And then safety, right? Safety, we can't think ourselves into safety. So I can tell you this is safe all I want to. I can tell you I am safe all I want to. But if you don't feel safe, it's for nothing. So how are we listening to what people need for safety? How are we also moving into, there's this idea of like just being safe enough. Like, what is safe enough for us to be able to have this conversation? What is safe enough for us to be able to move these pieces forward? Because when your very body, especially, in instances of sexual violence, which all trafficking and all exploitation, sexual exploitation, is sexual violence. When your body in itself has not been a safe place, it can be very difficult to just be safe, to just feel safe, because it hasn't been, right? It hasn't been a safe space. So how can we get to safe enough? And how are we offering that to people? I had a client who they like to sit by the door. That's all. They just wanted to be sitting by the door. And it took us a couple times before, we were able to get to that piece. And that just completely changed the way that we were able to engage when we were in space together. So it's like, how are we being able to just kind of get curious about what's going on and how we can shift that? Being aware of power dynamics, right? So inherently, when somebody comes to us for support, we have an uneven power dynamic because as providers, we have knowledge, we have access to resource. We're sometimes who they have to convince or get through to be able to access resources, right? We sometimes get to say the yes or no on whether they're able to get housing support or food today or money for gas. We hold that. So inherently, it creates an uneven power dynamic. And power is a beautiful thing. Right. I think power sometimes, because it has been used in abusive and exploitative things, it can, kind of get a bad rap. But power is a beautiful thing, and we can share that rather than having power over through authority and manipulation and influence. We can have power with. And when we have power with, people are then able to also kind of tap into their own power. Empowerment. We can't empower others. It completely defies the definition of that word. Empowerment comes from that person. So you can't give it to somebody else, but you can provide spaces and pathways so that they're able to get there themselves, so that they're able to tap into that. Knowing that sometimes our power over includes influence. Maybe there's one program you really want this person to go into, or there's this one pathway that you're really hoping for them. And there's 3 others, but because you really think this is the one that they should go for, you only present one, you don't present the other 3. That's using your power over. You could have all the best intentions. You can feel like you're informed, but you're not sharing that power. You're not having an open discussion and letting that person make choices and that decision for themselves. You're using your influence over that individual. So recognizing that even when we are well-intended or we think we know best, really believing that people are the experts to their own life. Really knowing that there are a whole bunch of things that we aren't aware of. I may have like a glimpse of what is happening and supporting you with this, but there are so much other things that are happening for you that maybe we just haven't tapped into and that we could open up if I really give you choices. Right. Also, when we're talking about power dynamics that are unhealthy, what are often not present is choice and agency. So when we don't give people the full choices, regardless of how we feel about them, then we are also repeating that cycle of abuse by taking away their agency, by taking away their opportunities for choice. And we're doing the exact opposite we might be intending to do. With that, remembering people are more than their trauma. Again, there's, what is being a person-centered, a whole person approach, right? Considering all the different aspects. And we can only do that when we, really share that power and give people opportunity and choice, because they can consider the totality. And it doesn't mean that we don't get to be open and inform it, but how are we not taking their opportunity for decision-making? Some approaches and tools that we find important and that we use in our work include the trans-theoretical model, which is the stages of change. I think just foundationally around stages of change is really hard. How many of you have wanted to change something in the last 6 months? A few of you? How many of you have changed it? Kinda? Yes? Yes, and it is so hard. It is. How many of you maybe have come around to this change a few times? This isn't maybe your first go at it, or maybe you had to pause it and come back at it. It usually takes a while, right? It takes us a few tries. We don't usually get it on the first, and we, actually stages of change walks us through that process, but it's just really good for us to ground ourselves and understanding that change is hard. And sometimes we're talking about one thing, one behavior, one situation, right? When we're working with youth and we're asking them to step away from, situations of exploitation and things like that, we're asking them to change. It's not just one behavior, it's many behaviors. So how do we also break that change down to like maybe one behavior at a time, not the whole thing? How do we change one thing and then celebrate and get to that, and then maybe add another one? So bringing that back, change is hard for all of us. Harm reduction. Providers sometimes can have a difficult time with this one as well. They can feel like they're enabling young people. They can feel, well, they're only, especially with younger youth, there can be a difficulty with understanding that respecting young people's agency is important. But harm reduction, not only has it been proven to work and it's important, again, it moves us into those healthy spaces. It also recognizes that as individuals, we all engage in harmful activities, whether we sometimes recognize or admit to it or we don't. How many of you used a car today? Yeah, got in a car, maybe you drove it, maybe you lifted, maybe. Cars are a leading cause of death in the United States. It is a highly harmful, highly lethal activity that most of us engage in daily. Multiple times, actually. And there's a whole bunch of harm reduction things we have in place for that. Seatbelts, stop signs, stoplights, speed limits. Those are all harm reduction techniques, right? So also acknowledging that this is something that is used in our daily lives. And how can we just also expand that and acknowledge that, hey, there are dangerous things, there are harmful things, and we can try our best to engage in those activities while reducing harm. Not texting while driving, yes. All those pieces, right? So knowing that that's present. We use healing-centered coaching. If you're using motivational interview, it's kind of like in a partner to that. So just, again, it really allows us to let that young person be, or that individual be centered in the conversation, not guiding it, right? Not leading it to really letting them lead us there and us just using some of the tools to move it along. Transparent communication and informed consent. I'm sure many of you are mandated reporters. We get a lot of questions about this. Do you have to tell youth that you are a mandated reporter? I can't tell you what you have to do. But what we can say is that it's really important that we're honest with individuals we serve. It is really important that they're aware of what our limitations and requirements are within our work. It sets a framework for the way we're going to be able to work together. It also doesn't make them feel set up when you get to a certain point, because if you come in and you're like, yep, you can, we can talk about whatever you want here, we can have the conversations, and all of a sudden they're pouring their heart out and they're telling you all these things, and you're like, oh, but now I'm gonna have to call the police. That does not feel safe. That is not safe. That is a setup. Right? So how very, from the beginning, letting people know, does that mean that people are not going to tell you certain things? Yep. But it's their story and their narrative to tell. You don't get to make that decision for them. It's also really important in terms of safety planning. If somebody is sharing something that can involve police, that can involve, child protective services, including family members, including other siblings, how are we making sure we're safety planning across all those lines so that everyone is safe? Police activity within communities of color can often lead to lethality and harm. So how are we getting ahead of that and having those conversations honestly? So I think just making sure that we're being transparent in our communication, reminding young people what our roles are, what our requirements are, so that they're able to then make choices for themselves. And if they're choosing to move forward, we're able to do so in a way that we're safety planning and being aware of all the things. Last positive, youth engagement and development, right? Again, really centering in that individuals are experts in their life and that they are fully capable of realizing the things that they want to. How are we just creating the pathways and supporting them with the tool, gaining the tools, learning the tools to get to those things, right? Really letting them lead that and guide that is really important in this work. And remembering, especially if you're working with youth, that they are youth. Sometimes we'll get people who are working like with 20, 21-year-olds, and because they're over that age 18, they'll start like really navigating from like an adult perspective. And while, they're transitional age, so while they are getting into that adulthood, they're still young people. There's from brain development to just, what we have access to and what we've had access to is going to really impact where I'm at and how I'm able to navigate those things. So not forgetting that youth lens, not forgetting that kind of centering ourselves in that is also really important. And the last piece that I have is how do we do this work in a sustainable way, right? All the tools, all the knowledge, all the theories are fantastic, but if we aren't well and we aren't cared for and taking care of ourselves, then we're not going to be able to care for others. So how are you bringing in self-care, right? And self-care, thank you, Zareen, is not just about, and it can be, walks in the park, and can be breathing exercises. It could be, meditative things. It could be journaling. All those are examples of care. But we also firmly believe that it's also about accountability, right? How am I being accountable for myself? Because I can't ask that of others, and I can't ask others to also be accountable to me if I'm not doing it for myself. So yes, how am I not picking up that client phone call after hours, as urgent as it may be? How am I, sticking to where I need to be and not overstepping in some of these other places? There may be the pressures, we may feel that, but I also have to hold those boundaries for myself, right? Because no one else can. Those are some of the places where other people can, and those are the places that lead us into those impacts of harm. So if you have work that has large demand and it continue in dwindling resources, if you're exposed to difficult stories, if you work with clients who face insurmountable obstacles and have chronic needs, and sometimes it can feel that they get worse rather than better, then what is true is you're likely going to be impacted in some way. It's not if you will, it's when will you, right? And how ready are you to identify that that's taking place and that's happening? And also, who do you have on your corner that can help you identify that, right? Because sometimes we may not notice that that's what's going on for us, but somebody else can be like, hey, so I just want you to know that I've been noticing these things, right? What are our plans of actions and how ready are we to receive that? Some of the things that can help while we're going along is, where do your stories go? Maybe it's to a supervisor, maybe it's during a debriefing, maybe it's to a therapist, maybe it's to a journal, right? Where are these stories going? Were you trained for this? Are there things that you feel you need more skill building on so you're better equipped to do these things and have a greater capacity? What are your particular vulnerabilities, right? A lot of people who come into these fields of work have their own history and their own experiences. And while they can be the very reason why you do amazing, great work and are able to build rapport, they can also be soft spots in which we sometimes step out at some of those boundaries, or it can trigger us. So are you aware of that? And what is your work around those pieces? And how do you protect yourself while doing this really challenging work? Some of the things that we most often see come up include compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. If anyone is interested in learning more, we do also lead a training really specifically to the trauma impacts, as well as some best practices to care for yourself. And just quick assessment on a day-to-day. to kind of figure out where you're at and do some check-ins is how are you eating? How are you sleeping? And when did you last laugh? Not are you eating and are you sleeping, but how are you eating? And how are you sleeping? Is that sleep restful? Are you nourishing yourself? Are you enjoying those things? Or did you shove a Twix bar in your mouth while you were typing up notes? Because those, while yes, sometimes that's what it is, but then how are you also planning to and after this, I'm going to go sit down and have a really nourishing meal, or I'm going to have something that's really going to bring some life into me. No, calling us in, no calling out. So it's just a nice check-in, right? It's just a little check-in so we can see where we're going and then be able to be like, oh, maybe I need to take a moment. Maybe I need to do a little bit to care for myself. And it's not to, glaze over that, hey, the work is heavy and, sometimes we're understaffed and the pressures are still there and we have things to, meet and, maybe I'm feeling the pressure and maybe I don't have access to certain resources. It's not to glaze over, but the things we do have control and impact over, how are we kind of taking those in and really taking control of that in the places that we can and the things that we can do. Well, thank you all. I will share out these slides. This is my contact info. If y'all have any referrals for youth, again, we serve anybody that is at risk. So if you just have somebody that you're like, oh, I don't know, but maybe, please send them our way. We are happy to connect. We are happy to offer that support. We also do case consultation. So maybe they're not ready to come to us, but you would like some additional support. We're also happy to connect on that end. Our referral form is online, but you're also welcome to email me. Email's usually better than phone call or text. You can text that number as well, and I'm more likely to respond. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you so much for this training. Thank you so much for all your great ideas.